All right, so we're going to talk about diffusion and peer influence at the same time, because in the way that I think about it, I've lost my damn mouse. All right. The reason we put these things together is because we expect that peer influence is a kind of diffusion. And we're going to end up using the same underlying mechanisms to think about how lots of things spread through the network. And these things could be HIV, or they could be, a belief that Trump is fantastic, right? So whatever thing you think could flow through a network, right, we're going to treat the same way, right? And that's, of course, not true, right? But it's a reasonable fiction for getting us started, and the ways in which it's not true tend to be modelable, right? So for example, your belief about Trump might not be the same kind of an infection as it is as HIV is, but we can think instead about how the process of being infected with a love for Trump sort of can be sort of rethought of and imagined as a network dyadic process, much the same way that we might think about using condoms or having PrEP or something else, right? So the point is that there is a social analog to the ways in which beliefs and ideas move through that we can play with and leverage a lot of really good ideas coming out of disease and other kinds of spatial diffusion models. And so those are the ideas we're going to go to. So the plan then today is to think about some different ideas. We're going to start with the basic some sort of diffusion models that come out of epidemiology. Then we're going to then translate those into network models for diffusion, and we're going to talk about the things in a network that govern the spread of things through the network, right? So that is, we're going to talk about how the features of the network constrain the likelihood for diffusion, again, mainly within this kind of sort of binary, do I get the disease or not sort of idea. And then we're going to talk a lot about the distinction between the topology of the network, that is how the network itself is shaped, and the timing of the network, how do the dynamics of the network move through. And this is particularly important for some kinds of work as opposed to others. And then these ideas we're going to translate into the questions of peer influence. All right, so diffusion ideas, all right, is this notion that something is spreading through the network. We talked about this the first day. This is the famous study by Katz, Coleman, and Menzel. I'm going to try to do that. That we're done at 12? So the idea is that, because I can go off on this topic for hours, so I'm trying to contain myself. So this notion of a diffusion curve, right, is that popular positions get it first and then unpopular positions get it later. The idea is that things are spreading through the network. If you think about this in terms of a peer influence, right, it might be that the extent to which I am the effect of friends of friends on binge drinking, right? The more my friends drink, the more likely I am to drink, right? These are the kinds of ideas that we can think about. There are other examples, something like the proportion of ties created and maintained over time. It's a process of things like the depression, right? So there's lots of processes where we think that there's a thing happening on the network, and that thing affects the other people in the network, right? So it could be smoking, it could be drinking, it could be depression. It could be whether you decide to go to the baseball game or the museum, right? There's lots of different things that you might do that can affect your thinking. And so we want to use networks then to think about the processes that flows through the network. And the simplest idea of this is comes out of epidemiology. These are compartmental models, and we've all probably heard of susceptible and infective models, or susceptible, infected, and recovered models. And the idea is you have some people that are susceptible to the good, they're exposed to some people who are infected, right? And there's some probability, and we know the probability that an infected person is in contact with the susceptible, the probability of transfer, and from that we can just treat this literally as a series of linked equations to figure out the probability that you're going to be in any one of these states, right? So the beautiful part about these kinds of models is that I can literally express the change in the number infected as a direct function of these probabilities. The change in the number of susceptibles is a function right here. You can write it down, it's nice and clear, and that's because what we assume is that it's completely uniform connectivity, right? That there's a random draw given that I'm susceptible or infected, like being in that compartment is just it's just a flag on my head, a kind of hat I'm wearing, and either I'm wearing the susceptible hat or the infected hat, and otherwise I'm indistinguishable from everyone else. Right? And so that feature makes it really simple to move from one person to the next. And these models are really powerful, right? If I really want to understand what's going to happen with the zombie apocalypse, right, then I can have a state space, which is whether or not you're zombie or not. And if you're a zombie, right, then it turns out that you're slightly different. You can't have the same kind of recovery pattern than if you're not, and you get very different overall infectivity curves. And it turns out that if the zombies take over, they're going to take over. It turns out zombies are really hard to control. So just so you know, keep an eye on these things. The problem, of course, is that even sans zombies, the problem is that we have in the real world a lot of times the connectivity structure doesn't look like the random network. So another way of thinking about these compartments is we're assuming that there's a random connectivity in that. The likelihood that a susceptible meets an infected is just a random mixing probability. But the real world, of course, isn't random. We have this structure in it. And if we take account of that structure, it's probably going to improve our spread features. Now, it's not going to improve our spread features if the things that spread through the network are really easy, right? If it's things like something like sneezing, you don't need a network, right? Because the connectivity is effectively random, and the stuff moves so easy that it's hard to do it. But if you're thinking of something like a strongly held religious belief, or you think about something like an HIV or some other hard to transmit feature, then the fact that I'm contacted with some set of people and not others is probably going to matter a lot. And so it turns out that some of the things work better than others. So if we can imagine the probability of spread on a network, right? So if we start with the basic idea, what we're going to do, in my class I have kids do that. I should have done it today just to wake us up. I have the kids flip a coin, right, and then pass the coin down they go. If you start with one node, you have some probability that this node infects one of their neighbors, right, as a coin flip. That coin flip could be really, really low, right? So it's a very low probability of I passing on to J, a little higher, a little higher, a little higher, right? And so there's a feature that governs the spread of things in a network, which is I usually refer to as Pij, which is the probability that I could infect J. Pij is something we're going to largely ignore today, right? But it's probably the most important thing, right? So, and so it's not that I'm saying it's not important. It's just in and of itself not a network problem. It's usually a biology problem or a fake news problem or an advertising problem, right? And so everything we're going to talk about today is conditional on the probability of something moving. And there might be really good reasons to think about the probability of something moving varying across social classes or something like that. But we're going to leave that aside to focus primarily on the network structure side of this problem, right? Now, because it's a stochastic feature, there's also a lot of noise in diffusion processes, and we want to be able to account for that noise. And so the same set of probabilities, right, starting with the same node, just run that thing lots of different times, you'll end up with some variability across these features, and that's very natural. And so being able to distinguish a real diffusion from random diffusion is part of what we want to be able to do by the time we're done. All right. So when you think about what drives the spread of something through a network, there are two basic features. One is the shape of the network, and the second is the timing of ties. And we're going to start with the shape of the network because that's the easiest thing to do, and then we're going to talk about the timing. So the shape of the network, when I think about the shape of the network, I talk about these 5 features. And so it's reachability, distance, local clustering, multiple routes, and star spreaders. Reachability and distance is the idea that I can't spread something to somebody else unless I'm connected to somebody else, right? So if I can't reach you in the network, if you're quarantined, right, you can't get me infected. That's why if you're on a cruise ship and you get the measles and you come into port, we don't let you off the boat, right? And so the idea is that there is in order for the first necessary piece for spread of an infection or spread of anything through a network is that I can reach J. Given that I can reach you, right, which is a pretty low bar, the idea is that the distance between us is going to affect the likelihood of spread, right? So if I'm 1 step from you, I'm much more likely to infect you than I am 8 steps from you because the probability of infection is almost always less than 1, right? If it's an electric grid, like I grew up in the Northwest, in the rural part of Montana, we had a lot of electric fences around the place, right? If the fence was on, you got shocked, right? That's just what the fence did, right? I'm going to get shocked up here. There's a problem with bad jokes. I should watch where I'm walking. The probability of spread of most social goods, and certainly most biological goods, is not certain, right? And so because of that, that means that if you think about the spread of something over long distance, from 2 steps down to k steps, that's going to be a joint probability. So it's a probability that I flip a heads and a heads, and a heads, and a heads each time, right? So if my probability of infection is 0.6, then at 2 steps it's 0.6 times 0.6, down a single path is 0.36, right? Then by the time you get down here to 5 steps, I have like less than a 1 in 20th chance of getting there, right? So you want to think about the probability of spread as being conditional on the distance in the graph. And this is why closeness centrality or other kinds of centrality scores have been so important in a lot of network modeling, because we think about things radiating through the network, like low probability events. Central nodes have a higher likelihood of reaching lots of people because they have fewer steps to go through to get to those people, right? So just from a sheer random probability process, if I'm central in the network, my information finds its way out through the network because it has fewer intermediaries to go through, right? The flip side of this, now this kind of, yeah, there we go. So if it decreases the distance for the same volume, the local clustering is the idea that you create local redundancies. And so if you can imagine that in these two little example diagrams here, we start with the root node in the tree. I'm going to hold their degree to be exactly the same each time. So this person has degree 2, this person has degree 1, this person has degree 0. If I keep that exactly the same, but I reroute some of these edges to have local clustering, you see that I reach fewer people. And you reach fewer people because what's going to happen is a clustered network is that if I'm already connected to you, and you're connected to Billy, and we're friends with each other, then that tie is redundant. And a redundant tie means you don't quickly and efficiently reach lots of people. Now, redundancy has some other features to it we'll get to in a second, but the main thing from this way of thinking about it is the one feature of clustering is that it lowers the efficiency of a network. And so when the probability of spread is really high, clustering lowers the reachability in the network for the same volume. That is, holding the volume constant. Right? On the other hand, right, the thing that clustering does is it does create this idea of multiple routes. So if you think about our probability problem again, right, if I have a single path, then I say that the probability of A reaching B reaching C is just A and B and C and D. But if I have 2 routes, right, or 3 routes or 4 routes, I get an OR, right? So I can go down the left path or the right path, both of which are unlikely, but if I have 2 paths, then I add those together as opposed to multiply the probabilities. So adding probabilities sort of increases it. And the idea then is that cohesion, or the amount of redundancy, creates more of these paths, and then you get opportunities. And so you have this trade-off then between these two features. So the clustering feature creates lots of local ties, but the cohesion creates lots of multiple routes, right? And so these things can play off each other depending on where you're at. The reason that we like this idea of structural cohesion from a diffusion notion is that we really are focusing on the path potential of the network. So for us, meaning Doug White and myself, when we think about cohesion, we think of this thing called node connectivity. And the node connectivity is the number of paths, the number of nodes that would have to be removed from the graph to disconnect it, right? So reachability is the ability that we're connected. If I remove 2 nodes from the network, that means the network is too connected. And in this example we talked about before, right, over here, there's no connectivity, so there's no diffusion risk from the top to the bottom. Here there is one path, so if I can go through this single cut node, then I have 1, 2, and 3, but it's all the same volume. And so as the number of paths increases, the number of alternate routes increases. And that number of alternate routes is the thing that creates robustness to low probability events. Clear? As an example, consider the Project 90 data. In Project 90, this was a project done on collecting street sort of people that had high risk for HIV in the 90s. And they collected relations on sexual ties and on needle exchange and shared needle ties. And these are what the 2 networks in that population look like, right? So these are mainly, so these little hubs are commercial sex workers. They're Johns. And there's a sort of a core group in the middle here that have about, if I remember right, 3, I think is the 3 connected component that I've highlighted here. So these folks have 3 independent paths all between each other. But sex ties, by the very virtue of their rarity, it's really hard to get dense interconnected clusters in a sexual network. Whereas if you're sharing needles, right, you can get these really close, tight-knit cliques, right? And so the part of the reason that drugs, that HIV and HPV and other kinds of things spread faster through needle exchange networks is not just that you've increased the probability. It's easier to infect somebody when you break the skin. Right? It's not just that, but it's also the social structure has lots of this redundancy built into it, right? So if you think about the cohesion of a group, the more likely you are to have these robust routes. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here, though, is that these two features I've explained to you, like this transitive closure clustering feature, which limits the number of people you can reach quickly, and the cohesion feature work in opposite directions. But they're kind of the same thing, right? So if I get lots of local clustering, I do increase my local cohesion. But that comes at a cost of spreading ties to lots of people efficiently. And so these things are a trade-off, right? And so and what this means is that it's sometimes an empirical question to the extent of that trade-off, whether or not you're getting the efficiency lost due to essentially closing the number of people you can reach in a small number of steps. So whether or not that constrains diffusion more than the redundancy improves diffusion is an empirical question in any given setting. What typically, the rule of thumb that we have, sort of at least that came out of the HIV world in the late 90s, early 2000s, is that highly clustered networks lead to jumpy epidemics, right? So what happens is you get a lot of infection quickly, then it's hard to spread out of it, and then it bumps up again, and then it dies out, then it bumps up again, and it dies out. And so if you have a very clustered network, you can reach a small number of people quickly, but you never reach as many people as you would in another network. Okay? The final thing that we think about is this notion of star spreaders. And this comes out of the scale-free literature, or the preferential attachment literature. There are some nodes that are simply better connected in the network than others. And so this is the things we've been talking about thus far are largely graph-level features. The thinking here is this is an individual-level variance within the network. So if I'm central to the network, that means that I'm a bridge to lots of other sets and can reach lots of folks quickly. And if I were to remove them, it would break the network apart. That is, and if a network here, nothing could spread on this network because no one's connected to each other, whereas here people are connected to each other, and so we can imagine lots of spread. And so we want to think about whether or not this heterogeneity in degree or centrality can contribute to the likelihood of spreading. And that's what we think about in terms of assortative networks or disassortative networks. In an assortative network, if I have lots of ties, my friends have lots of ties. In a disassortative network, if I have lots of ties, my friends tend not to have lots of ties. Right? So this is a classic commercial sex network where you have commercial sex workers will be connected to folks who have fewer ties than they do, whereas in an assortative network, you have something like popular kids in high school tend to hang out with other popular kids in high school. All right, do these basic features make sense? So Ashton Verdery and I, Ashton's not here today, I thought he might show up, did some work on this problem a while ago to say, well, we know all these things matter. Let's put them in a horse race with each other and see which ones matter the most. And so we took all of the ad health data networks, just used them, and we generated a simulation study on the ad health networks, where we set some probability of transfer. All right, we seeded the network with a bug and let it spread through the network, and then we asked, do we reach more people, in networks where there's lots of star spreaders or networks where there's high cohesion, right? So we can think about these things working this way through. And so this is giving an example of how we measured this. The problem, of course, is that when you're thinking about spread through a network, some networks are bigger than others, some networks are denser than others. There's lots of variability across networks that we want to account for. So what we did is we took these kinds of distribution curves that we would observe in a regular network like this, and we compared that to what we would observe in a random network of the same size and density, right? So we took the same size and degree distribution, actually. And we said, well, if the network were random, you would get this average diffusion curve. In the observed network, we got this diffusion curve. Right? And so the difference between the random and the observed is going to be our measure of diffusion potential. In this network, you get a much faster diffusion than you get in this network, relative to a comparable random null. So that's the logic we were using in this case. And as it turns out, that of course you find that the longer the distance there are in the networks, the lower the probability of having diffusion. But the more cohesion you find in the network, the higher you have. The more diffusion you have. So at least in these settings, cohesion in the network, this amount of structural cohesion can counteract the effect of long distance quite dramatically, actually. And there's some other coefficients. We have things for homophily and things like that. Those are in the slide deck. So by and large, at least for networks that aren't super strongly clustered, just to come back to the key point, cohesion tends to, the beneficial effects of cohesion, that is the diffusion promoting effects of cohesions, seems to override the reachability constraining effects of cohesion. Now if we can flip this question a little bit different and ask what drives, what features might lead to a spread in a given network. How can we think about the emergence of diffusion risk in a network? We did this in, Martina Morris and I did this thinking about sexual networks and HIV by thinking about what the degree distribution implies for the underlying connectivity of the network. And so I gave this example on, I think, the first day. If you have a network that has very few ties, like the average, the most ties we see in this network are 3, and then most people have 1 or 2 ties. This is what you might expect to see in a year in a general population. So there are a few people that are active, but most people are not. And then then we just do a little simulation experiment where we say, now let's shift some of these folks who have 1 ties. Let's shift them so the degree distribution, now they have a few more with 3, a few more with 3, a few more with 3. And we move here from an average degree of 1.68 to 1.87, and you move from a network that has no connectivity to a network that has high connectivity. And this is this idea that I talked about a little bit yesterday, that if you think about the average number of ties, right, I didn't pick those values randomly. I cheat all the time, just so you know, if we ever play cards together. So I picked those ties because they're right at what's known as the phase transition in connectivity. And for random networks of any given size, right, if you have a low average degree, at some point you get almost no connectivity. There's just nothing to speak of. But once you cross this threshold, you rapidly get connectivity. And what's important is the shape of the degree distribution matters. So if you have this, what we're calling the short degree distribution, this low volume degree distribution, so nobody has more than 3 ties, the phase transition is really, really sharp. Right? It goes from nothing to something over the course of a very small span. Whereas if you have a scale-free distribution, as you have a few star actors, you get a somewhat more gentle spread in the degree distribution. You can also think of that in terms of the largest bi-connected component, right? So, this is the largest bi-component, right? So if you think of a scale-free distribution, their component starts to grow a little bit earlier, but it takes a lot longer to get big, right? And so this is all about how the degree distribution, that is the number of partners each person in the population has, how that distribution shapes the overall risk set. And this is kind of interesting because from a volume standpoint, these 2 networks are the same, right? So in this case, we're dealing with a long-tailed degree distribution. In the blue cases, we're dealing with a short-tailed degree distribution. And so we thought, well, wouldn't it be fun if we were to distinguish these 2 distributions across an entire space, right? And so this is what this image that I showed you yesterday. If you think about the amount of ties you have in the network, of course, as the network gets more volume, we expect there to be greater connectivity. But how does that effect differ by the shape of the distribution? And so we just did the obvious thing, is that we went and simulated from this space. And so we went through and let's imagine that low degree in this space of the average degrees by the shape of the distribution. One curve here defines all possible graphs of that low degree distribution. The upper bound here is all possible graphs with a scale-free distribution, but the actual universe of graphs is in here. There's lots of different kinds of graphs you could find. If you look at it, we search through it, we get lots of different possible distributions, right? So this is an example of what one of these distributions might look like. So here you have a few people with 1, lots of people with 2, and a somewhat truncated tail. Out here, most people have 1 tie, 2 tie, maybe a couple people out here, and the little circle indicates where in that space you might be. And this is the result, right? And so this is the graph I showed you yesterday in the visualization set. You see a pretty rapid shift from lots of disconnected groups, right? Then the emergence of a large component in blue or bicomponent in red, and it gets really big up here in the set. Qualitatively, we can think about these networks in terms of what the little hub, the connection between the spindles and the hub in this case, right? And so the hub in the middle of this network here is relatively small and kind of sparse, right? So you can see lots of long paths built in terms of that hub. Whereas if we move down just a little bit, right, it's even more sparse down here. So the short degree distribution gives you a large connected bicomponent, but it's not a very robust bicomponent. And if you go up here, you get much denser and then just truly insane. I think my thing's going to work. Probably not. But anyway, the visualization is just cute and fun to play with. But you can map the overall reachability or the robust reachability. And what's interesting about this setting is that if you're only focusing on volume, you might have a slightly different interpretation of what to do in this setting, right? So what we find, of course, is that in general, as you go up the volume scale, you get greater connectivity. But it's not equally distributed across the set. So if you have a really long-tailed distribution, you get greater connectivity than you would down here, but not as much as if you take that same volume and shift over here. And to put a context on this, imagine that what drives the tail of a degree distribution in a sexual network, it tends to be commercial sex workers. And so if you want to think about how you might intervene to try to stop the spread of STDs in a setting, well, an obvious thing to do is try to crack down on commercial sex workers. If all that does is drive sex underground and it distributes it to more people, right, then what you've effectively done is you've moved from having some long-tailed sort of distribution folks and you've taken all that same volume and put it underground, and you've actually made things worse, right? So if you really want to affect the overall distribution of risk in these settings, you want to affect the x-axis, not the y-axis, but the obvious targets are going to have a greater effect on the y-axis than the non-y-axis. And so thinking carefully about these features can help you make sure not to do something particularly stupid in the intervention set. So that's a really fast description of how the shape of the network changes risk for spread. Questions or comments before we move on to the timing?
In the context of sex work, in terms of reducing that x-axis, how, like, do you have an idea of how one would do that?
Largely education, right? So what we did in the sub-Saharan African case was really try to say, look, it's not so much the number of partners you have overall, it's the number of partners you have now, right? And so we'd say, we're not saying don't have sex, don't have fun. We're saying, look, really, like one at a time. Right? No grazing was the campaign that we put into the field. And the thinking there was, you don't want to get rid of the, you really don't want to get to the point where you take the demand. So the key is to sort of focus on demand. Now, the old way to do that was to scare adolescents. I'm not sure that actually worked that well, though arguably what's happened at the shift from the late 90s to the present is because people aren't afraid of HIV the way they used to be. We're seeing a huge increase in other kinds of STDs that weren't there before, right? So it's not entirely clear that scaring isn't all that, but we'd rather, I think, have real education than that. But that would be the way to do it. Please.
So is this assume the network keep constant and the network will not change over time?
The simulation I showed you a minute ago was showing it was a static shot. So what would the network look like if we just summed up all the relations in, say, a 6-month window, right? And depending on the context, that could be a 6-month window or it could be a 6-day window. But the thinking is that it's a constant sort of sum over a window.
Yeah, so because that, for example, if a person gets the HIV, you may change the network over time. So the inverse is that.
Right, so there's plenty of things that might affect the likelihood of a particular person coming in or out of the population. In particular, your status might affect the likelihood of having a tie, for those who couldn't hear in the back. That's absolutely true. What that's going to do is it's going to say some different folks in the network, like if they get infected, might change their behavior. Does it change the overall shape of the network or not is an open question, right? And I don't think we know. But it does take us right to the next question, which is how the timing of ties affects the spread of goods in the network. All right, so the basic timing idea is this notion I hinted at the first day, which is that you can't spread something to someone you're not connected to downstream in time. That is, diffusion always occurs over a temporal process. So if you think about the way that the relationships unfold over time, then the timing of ties affects the spread. And I like to think about this as the fact that we actually have 3 distinct networks on a dynamic network. We have the contact network, and that's what we've been focusing on all week. That's the list of I's and J's connected to each other. We have the exposure network, which is the people who I could reach given the timing of ties. That is, given that I've infected you, or I've been in contact with you, and later you've been in contact with somebody else, and that means that third person is at an exposure risk from me. So the exposure network is the subset of edges in the network that are viable for diffusion given the ordering of the temporal relations on that set. And then there's a transmission network, which is a subset of 2, which are the probability that is the realized transmission given the probability of a tie. As is often the case in the network thinking, pictures are easier than words. So imagine that we have a little sample graph here where the values on top of the edges are the times they happen. So just without loss of generality, I just treat these as spells. So this happened at time 3, this happened at time 4, this happens at time 1. So person A then, at time 2, could infect person B, right? But couldn't, through this edge anyway, affect person L, because this relationship has already ended before this relationship happened, right? So from an exposure standpoint, I can go from A to B, but I can't go from B to L directly. It turns out at time 2 I could go to here, at time 3 I could go to here, at time 4 I could go to there. So there is a 3-step path between A and L. So L is exposed to A, respecting the temporal ordering, but not through the shortest path. All right? Does it make sense what the constraint is? Things have to move forward in time given when they occurred. So imagine an infection starting at the earliest possible time that D enters the network infected. That means at time 1, D can infect E. At time 3, E can infect F. At 4, can go there. Can't go back this way, right? Because the time from 4 to 2, you can't go backwards in time. From 3 to 2, can't go backwards in time. 3 to 2, can't go backwards in time. So D can reach F, but G and I are never at risk to infection from D. Does that make sense? So that's the exposure network. So we can layer that over. We can go through and say, let's now think about who's at risk from infection from someone else by thinking about the unfolding in ties, and you end up with a much smaller subset of folks in the network, and then the people who are actually exposable are going to be a subset of the overall pieces. Now, what's interesting about this set is that the exposure risk is always person-specific, right? So that same path down the network is going to be given that I've entered the network at time 1, right? That conditions when the rest of my spread can flow through the network. This is some formal language that defines when an edge is when it's possible. So a path is a sequence of adjacent edges. A time-ordered path is a sequence of adjacent edges for which each pair, the start time of the first edge is less than or equal to the end time of the second edge, which is just, again, a fancy way of saying two edges are temporally orderable if one starts before the other one ends, and they are adjacent. Concurrency occurs when two relationships exist at the same time. So now I need spells to get this idea across, as opposed to just, so I need an actual difference in start and end time. So we can see that the A and B relationship starts at time 1, ends at time 3. So it starts at time 1, ends at time 3. The B and C relationship starts at time 2 and ends at time 7. So B wasn't going to give up his relationship with A until he had someone else on the hook, right? And so there's some overlap here, right? And so this is what concurrency is. It's having relationships that are adjacent around the node but overlap in time, right? Whereas the BC relationship goes on for a long time. C has another side relationship during it, right? This is a different kind of concurrency. This is, you can think of this as just sort of hedging your bets, right? So these things are still time ordered, they just overlap a little bit in time. This one is a fully embedded in the other. But for our purposes, what's important for this is concurrency changes the risk set of the exposable path. And it does it in the way as follows. If this relationship starts at time 1 and ends at time 2, time 3 times 4, time 1 and times 2, there's no concurrency here. And so A can start early and go later. A can reach C, right? But C can't reach A. B can't reach D, but D can reach B. If your relationships are not concurrent, you always get this kind of asymmetry in indirect reach, right? So if your relationships do not overlap in time, indirect connectivity is always forward in time and always asymmetric. Right? If your relationships overlap in time, that's not the case, right? So here A is connected to B, but that relationship overlaps with B's relationship with C. That means for this period of time, right, C can infect B and come back to A. Whereas if they're not related in time, that's impossible. So this asymmetry that is induced by monogamy goes away as soon as you have concurrency. And this is why concurrency matters, right? Concurrency matters not because it increases the number of relations, but because it opens a whole new branch in the exposure network, right? Whereas before, the exposure network would always be moving downhill in time. It has only one space to go. And you can think about each new relation as sort of a switch on a rail car. I go this way, I go that way, I go that way, I go that way. As soon as you reach a concurrent edge, you go two ways, right? And so it creates a bifurcation in the exposure paths that allow more people to be exposed to more others. And what's really important about this timing effect is concurrency is an operation from a diffusion standpoint, concurrency is a feature that affects the reachable path distribution. It doesn't affect an individual's risk at all, particularly the individual who's engaged in the concurrency, right? It affects the people downstream from you because it opens them up to an entirely new set of relations, but it really doesn't change your own individual behavior much at all. And this has been one of the confusions about modeling concurrency in the literature, is that if we run a regression of do you have concurrent ties or not, and are you infected or not, the correlation is pretty small, because that's asking the wrong question. The graph theoretical effect of concurrency has very little effect on the individual person. It just increases their degree of I1, and not even that if you think about the wide enough temporal window. But what it really does is it changes the exposure set overall. And a nice way to see that is to imagine, again, an exposable path network. Here, let's assume that we have a completely, the real relations, the sexual relations are in red, and the indirect relations are in black. And at this particular note, all these relations are concurrent, right? So if all these relationships are happening at the same time, then I can spread something clockwise or I could spread something counterclockwise. Between every pair of nodes in the network, there are two possible ways that A could reach B. Right? If I order the relations, now that this relationship happens at time 1, this one at time 2, this one at time 3, and so forth, so person 1 can reach everybody, right? Person 4 can reach half the people. And so you get this kind of upper triangle sort of reachability effect. If I interleave the times, right, the reachability goes down, right? Even more or even more, right? So the key point here is that by only changing the timing of relations, I've changed the exposure set in the network. Right? Nobody's actual, the people they've had sex with haven't changed. All that's changed is when it's occurred. Right? And it happens at the system level, not the individual level. So the exact same contact network can then lead to either a completely dense clique or a very sparse connectivity network. Right? And so the reason that monogamy sort of, again, I don't care how many partners you have over the course of your life, the issue about having one partner at a time is that that protects the population from this multiple spread issue, this multiple path issue. It also does some really cool, geeky things that those of us that are playing with network objects like to think about, which is that if you have a temporal ordering, some of the operations on graphs that we're used to doing to get things like path distances now change. So if you think about who this person can reach, again, these are timings on tops of the edges, right? The shortest path from person A to person F over here should be this one, 1, 2, 3, right? But it turns out that this happens at time 5, this happens at time 6, this happened at time 4. That's an impossible path. So even though the graph theoretic distance from A to F would be 3, the temporal exposure distance is 4. Right? And so things that and what's really fun about that is that the distance between the partners, this is 2 steps, that's 1 step. You'd think that if A and B are 2 steps from each other and B and C are 1 step from each other, then A and C should be 3 steps from each other, and not they're 4 steps, right? This kind of intransitivity that is built, that's a different way of using that word, this kind of sort of non-additive feature of the networks is because of these overlapping paths differ in the way they're timed. Does that make sense? Right. So this is kind of cool. It leads to all sorts of different features. We can think about temporal geodesics and so forth. And there's a bunch of pieces on that we can play with. Again, to make it really clear that it's a population feature and not an individual feature. Imagine a network like this, right? Most of the people don't change their behavior at all. So all of these relationships happen at the same time. All of these relationships happen at the same time. If I just put a temporal edge between the two, I've gone from having everybody exposed to everyone else to having half the population saved from the other half, right? But again, most of the people don't change their behavior or even their relative sequence to their neighbors. It's just an upstream change changes the overall exposure risk. And you can play these games all day. We've done a lot of it. And this is what this graph means. So now I can tell you what this visualization about yesterday was really about. When we simulate networks out of real data, we can ask, what's the likelihood of identifying a concurrent edge down any of these infection trees? And it turns out that there's always an if you ask yourself, did this relationship depend on, for its exposure on a concurrent path upstream? And it turns out that that's what drives these infections, even in the simulation set. So even when you let the world have these kinds of trade-offs and moves, you end up getting sort of lots of churn. I forgot where the question came from earlier. So if you have an actual dynamic process where people come and go out of the population, this still has the same kind of effect. All right. Where I need to be. All right, so it turns out, so questions or comments on timing. We talked about structure, and we talked about timing, and now I'm going to combine the two, please.
So, could you go back to the slide with the 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6?
This one? Yeah.
That one. So we got 4, even though, okay, so when you have 5 and 6, that means that it happened after 3 and 4?
Right, exactly. So this one happens at time 5, this one happens at time 6.
But are we counting, so we're counting the number of paths?
The number of steps it takes, so A can reach F over here through 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, 4 steps.
Okay.
Right? And that's time ordered correctly.
We're not including
Right.
this. Okay.
Whereas A can reach D in 2 steps at time 5 at time 6. Now he reaches them faster or earlier at time 3. Right? So if you were to think about, so this is one of the really fun.
Still count it. It just
Right.
depends on the node that you're.
Yeah. And so, it's really, it's one of the beauty of temporal networks is there's this whole class of new ways of thinking about the network. So instead of thinking about the shortest distance, I might think about the fastest path. I might think about the earliest path, the latest path, right? There's a whole set of really fun problems that open up once you start thinking about dynamic paths that, frankly, it still hasn't really been explored hardly at all. Right? All right, so now we can think about combining these two and asking them how they work. We can ask whether or not a diffusion potential is maximized or not. So what I'm going to do next is ask whether or not the exposure graph density so whether or not it's possible to reach other people in the network given the timing of relations as a and whether or not that concurrency effect, right? So whether the exposure boost that comes from concurrency is conditional on the graph structure itself, right? So do these things interact? Go back to Bria Perry's ideas. The way we do that is we can imagine comparing different sets of networks to how generally cohesive they are. Right? So in this network, I ask how many independent paths are there between each pair of nodes in the network, and we see for these little clusters, right, these are biconnected components inside. So it's 1 path from person 1 to person 6, but it's 2 paths from person 2 to person 5. And so we think about the number of paths that there are between each pair in the network. In this case, the average is about 1.25. So that's my key independent variable is going to be the structural cohesion of the network, and it might be that it's pretty sparse like this. It might be that it's a little higher like this. Right? We can get a whole bunch of different levels of connectivity. The data in this case are from a bunch of sampled networks that I have that I think are kind of like sex networks in that they have a relatively small number of relations, maybe a few clusters. These things plausibly these end up being sociology co-authorship networks, but I think they're kind of similar. But I won't go into that in too much detail. The main issue is you can imagine thinking about the networks as either being really dense, having very high cohesion, right, or being very sparse and dendritic. And it turns out that if you think about the proportion of the relations that overlap in time, which is one measure, sort of graph version measure of overall concurrency, and the proportion of people who can be reached through the network, this is the density of the exposure graph, that you always find that it goes up as concurrency goes up. So as concurrency increases, your risk goes up in the population as a whole. Right? Remember, this is the network is the unit of analysis. But for these really sparse, non-cohesive networks, you get a really rapid return to cohesion, whereas in the more cohesive networks, you're already at high risk because these alternate paths essentially compensate for the amount of cohesion. So what you end up finding, or by the amount of concurrency, excuse me. Because I can't help myself, I simulate this over literally hundreds of thousands of different combinations of these things, and you can find then when you go back and fit it, that what's occurring is that when you have really low cohesion, concurrency can matter a lot in these settings. But if the networks are already highly cohesive, concurrency doesn't matter. And so this helps explain why some differences across different countries where we find that even at the population level, there's a relatively low correlation in some countries between the level of concurrency and the level of overall risk in the setting, or the observed levels of HIV, for example. It's probably because the network structures in those settings are already very cohesive. Right? There's not a bunch of room for timing to matter. But in the, whoa, that was weird. So, but in these kinds of settings, you get a higher likelihood. Another way to do this is to flip it around and ask, what is concurrency doing? And so concurrency, overlapping in time, is creating an alternative route in the network, in the exposure graph, which is exactly what adding more ties does to the network. So when you have more concurrency in a network, it's just like having more ties in the network overall that are creating more cohesive settings. And so even though people might not be having that many partners in these settings that have low cohesion, right? So the overall number of partners might differ. The fact that they overlap might be relatively low. And the fact that they overlap in time over here is just like having, if you were to read this graph sideways, being at this level at the structural feature is just like being at a cohesion level much higher over here with less concurrency. So these things trade each other off. What concurrency does to a setting from a diffusion standpoint is create multiple paths and makes it possible for the system as a whole to be better connected. Does it seem sensible? Okay. All right, the third type of diffusion this got a lot of press recently. It comes out of the work of Damon Centola. It's called complex contagion. And this is a particularly social kind of contagion. It doesn't matter at all for biology. It matters a lot for social features. And the way complex contagion works is that whereas in a biological diffusion, if I've got the bug and you don't have the bug and I interact with you, I can give you the bug, right? And you don't really have much of a choice over it, right? Whereas if I try to tell you the virtues of an orange-headed president, right, I can really sort of go into this, right? You can decide that I'm just full of crap and ignore me, right? Well, that's entirely up to you. And so this notion of being able to think about something and then decide as an individual leads to a whole host of different ways of thinking about the actual transmission process. And one of the things that we can think about it doing is that it changes the importance of the message depending on the number of people who send me the message, right? So if I hear about something from one person, right, it's very different than hearing about that exact same thing from multiple people. And so the way complex contagion works is that you can imagine that I only adopt the behavior if some proportion of my friends, above some threshold, which is my contagion sort of susceptibility, so long as some complex number of my friends have the good, then I will also do it. A great example, this is true for beliefs, or we think it's true for beliefs, but it's also true for things that are complementary goods, right? So it doesn't do me any good to buy a cell phone unless some number of my other friends also has a cell phone. This is the canonical example. That if there are network spillover effects to the good, then it's very little use to being a first adopter of some of these things, because if no one else is using it, then I can just play it by myself and have anything else happen. I don't talk to anybody on my phone anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I'm one of those cases that Bria Perry was talking about that, as long as I have a spouse, I don't need anybody else to talk to. So the idea of a complex contagion is that you need at least some k number of your neighbors to adopt before you will adopt. So in this little example here, we can imagine that adoption requires k people, right? And so in this particular case, if both of these people adopt, right, then this person would adopt at time 2. Right, so at time 1, these folks have it. At time 2, this person would take it. That's supposed to mean we should take a break. Need a break?
No.
No? All right. I'm trying to be honest with myself here so we can keep this working. All right, so at time 1, right, these folks, really, we don't need a break. All right, okay. So at time 1, we have 2 people that have it. That means that this person has there's one person who has 2 friends that have the good. So this person might adopt. Now that means that later this person has 2 friends. So now at time 3, this person will adopt. These folks will never adopt, right, because they never have the opportunity to have 2 friends have the good. Right? So complex contagion requires multiple paths. So if you don't have multiple connectivity, you can't have complex contagion. And it also then does a nice job of explaining how bits can get stuck in pockets, right? Because it's hard for this bit to jump out of this good over to the rest of the network because it can't go across a single bridge. And again, because you're starting to get the flavor, this is kind of how I work, right? If I have a question, I simulate it, right? To see what occurs. So we can take a bunch of networks that you might happen to have on your shelf, like all the AdHealth networks or all the Prosper networks. I don't remember which one this is. And we can then seed a pair of nodes that are connected, right? So we do that in order that have some friends in common in order to ensure that at least this infection can get started, right? If you were to randomly pick 2, it couldn't go anywhere. And ask how far might it spread. And it turns out, right, that you often get these kinds of pockets, right, because the infection starts at one place, it spreads quickly to the people who are redundantly connected, and then dies out. Because anytime there's this clustering or bridging or brokering problem, you can't cross that bridge unless it has an independent start from another side. And if you run the simulation across lots and lots of different pieces, right, and see what happens, you get this kind of distribution, right? You either get nobody infected, right, or if you happen to get really, really lucky and pick just the right sequence of sets, you might get everybody infected. You end up with these very bimodal distributions of infectivity that tends to be due largely to the transitivity ratio in the network. That is, if you have lots of closed triads, then it's possible for the pairs to sort of do this hopscotching through the network. Right? But the only reason I'm really throwing this, there's some empirical evidence that this is true, but I don't really care about that right now. The reason that we talk about complex contagion is I want you to see this as an opportunity that you can think socially about the spread of a good and a unique feature, like I have to learn from two people, right? That's a very simple rule. But you might have to have a different rule. I have to learn from somebody like me, right? So if I'm only going to I don't like with these young kids today, I don't believe a damn thing they say, right? But if an old person tells me, then I believe it, right? So you can imagine that there's a way, right, in which there's some social process that layers over a diffusion process. It's an intersection either of the pattern of ties or the categories of ties that change the likelihood of spread through the network. And our job as social analysts is to then go in and identify what that is. Complex contagion is one that is nice. The physicists took it up because it has a lot of interesting features for it when you go mathematically, and they did a bunch of things with it. But socially, it's a way for us to help think about layering social processes over the top of diffusion processes. How much of your time, when do you start, Jeff? Maybe 12:30. I'll be nice and let him go on. All right, so now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. That was a not so good segue into the peer influence process. All right, so now we're going to move directly from questions of biology to questions of behavior. And the basic model we're going to work here is essentially an idea that goes from peer effects to dynamics on graphs. And the foundation of this work comes out of Noah Friedkin's book called The Structural Theory of Social Influence. This is an old model that comes that he built out of some earlier work in the 50s about social contagion, but probably the single best book if you want to get the sort of mathematical foundations to this work is Noah Friedkin's book, The Structural Theory of Social Influence. And he makes an argument that belief processes in the network are a two-part process. On the one hand, you have individual characteristics, right? So the kind of person I am helps determine what I believe, right? So if I'm an old balding male, then I believe things that are different than if I were a young balding male, right? That's how we do it. So things like gender, or age, or race, or whatever predicts what we believe. This is standard sociology 101, right? Like whatever you have, like the kind of person you are determines what you believe in the world. But then we take that and we layer on top of that a set of interpersonal influences. And he formalizes this as the two-system equation that at time one, right, at some mythical initial state of nature, time one, my beliefs on some vector y is a function of the kind of person I am and a set of coefficients. This is just a matrix algebra representation of a regression model, right? This is nothing none of us have ever seen before. But then at time t, right, so the next time step, my belief in this good is a function of my initial belief at time one, plus the effect of my friend's belief at t minus 1. And these two are traded off each other by this thing called the interpersonal influence parameter. And so it's some portion of my belief at time t is a function of my belief at time 1, and the remainder is a function of my belief of my friend's belief. Right? So it's just a trade-off between these two features. And what's nice about this effect is that a lot of these things are really straightforward to estimate. And so a key part of this model, right, is that if you say there is no interpersonal influence, then the other one falls away, and it's like my belief is just a function of my attributes. If there's no sort of inherent reason why I would believe something other than communication, then it's the case that it's all interpersonal influence, right? So A governs all of this. Now the magical feature in this little equation is W. And so W is called the weight matrix. And the weight matrix is captures the interpersonal influence. It's a rescaling of the adjacency matrix. And we rescale the adjacency matrix such that the Wij value is always going to be between 0 and 1, right? And the sum is always going to be 1. And the reason we do this is that if the sum was greater than 1, then the Y value would start to expand, right? So what all this is really doing is this is making that alpha nicely scaled between -1 and +1, but it also then makes it such that we don't get systems that explode, right? We don't get contagions where people start to panic. Now, if you have a setting where it's possible for people to panic, right? If we can imagine a social system where it's reasonable to assume that by me telling you something, you believe something more than you ever believed it before, right? If I can scare the hell out of you, right, then it might be possible to think of this as not adding to 1, right? So there could be special situations, but by and large, this is by far the most common way of doing it. Now, once you say that, it's still a lot of room for the individual to decide how to specify this weight matrix. Right? So you can specify it as even, that each of my contacts are equally set. It might be that I have a self-weight that I put that I believe my last period's belief more than my than anyone else. It might be that if I have a lot of ties, I believe things less than I have a few ties, right? So you should have some social theory for this. Far and away, the most common approach is to do an even weighting, right? That essentially all my friends are equal, or it's proportional to the amount of time I spend with my friends, or something like that. Don't get bogged down in that idea right now. Now, one of the nice things about this feature is that if you let this process go over time, say yt is a function of what's happening at t-1, and you let that go over at t, then t plus 1, t plus 1, t plus 1, t plus 1, what happens is it will converge on this. And so at equilibrium, if you let this process go on long enough, what's beautiful about it is you can estimate the equilibrium outcome as a static function of the equilibrium outcome of my peers. Right? So notice a little infinity sign there. That assuming the matrix itself doesn't change, right? So assuming my tie coefficient, who I'm tied to stays constant, right? And you let the social process influence work its way out, that it will converge on these values. And that's a very nice feature. Now, those of you that have been staring at this for a minute, you might recognize this equation. This is a spatial autocorrelation regression, right? So this is literally exactly the same as a spatial autocorrelation model, where instead of being an interpersonal influence matrix, this is the distance in space, right? So if I wanted to run a spatial autocorrelation model, the beauty of a spatial autocorrelation model is this is a very well-behaved matrix, right? It's a nice planar, two-dimensional thing. If I'm 2 steps from you and you're 2 steps from someone else, we'll be 4 steps from each other, right? None of those things happen to be true in a social network, so the convergence issues can be kind of weird. But intellectually, it's no different than any other spatial autocorrelation model. Right? Give you a sense of what this convergence idea looks like. Imagine that I assign people an initial opinion at time, at state of nature at time 1. So person 1 has a value of 1, person 4 has a value of 7. Right? So at time 0, that's their initial opinion. If you allow this interpersonal influence process to occur with an alpha of about 0.8, right, at time 1, you start to see that the first person, which was these people at the extreme, they start to come towards the middle, right? So 2.6 to 6.2, a little more towards the middle, more towards the middle. By the time you get to the end out here, right, the difference used to be 6 points between the two, and now the difference is only 2 points between the two. So one of the features of, is it a feature or bug, but one of the features of the model as specified is this is known as a consensus model, right? I'm going to take on the value that is the average of my peers. Those of us that have ever watched the news in 2018 or 2019 wonder where consensus ever went, right? So it's not clear a consensus model works all the time. But for lots of things, particularly our beliefs about the world, say our health beliefs or something like this, a consensus model, it's not clear that a consensus model is a bad model. And if you have a different model, we can specify that. If I specify this process to be 1, perfect peer influence, in fact, we will come very close to converging on the exact same value. So to give you an example of how this works, right, sort of a process, again, this is all about building the theory of the model. So what is this model predicting? Imagine I have a world of 3 groups, right, and I'm going to put those 3 groups in a 2-dimensional belief space. Right? So you believe something about X, you believe something about Y. These are random values. It doesn't matter. They mean nothing. Right? It's just an illustrative idea. And so at the initial time, we all hold random beliefs. I'm going to say, look, I'm going to sell you a widget, right? And I think this widget is both beneficial, which is my x-axis, and healthy, right? I'm trying to sell it to you. No one's ever seen it before, brand new invention. It never existed before today. All of our opinions are random, right? So we don't know anything about it, except for the fact that some of my friends have got this widget, and they're going to tell me what they believe about it, right? So we let that process go over time, and what occurs is we start to take on the opinions of our friends, right? And so this is, we're going to have a series of slides that look like this, right? We start, we go through, and it looks like now, you'll notice here that the red folks all believe the same thing, the green folks believe the same thing, and the black folks believe the same thing. Now, if the network has a fair amount of connectivity between them, then you end up getting a lot less convergence overall. So in this case, if I remember right, what did I say? Yeah, so now what we're doing, we're saying the exact same matrix, but I believe people who are in my group more than I believe people who are not in my group, and you end up getting very distinct beliefs about this setting. Right? And you can play lots of different games with this, right? So imagine a world where we have heterodox beliefs and orthodox beliefs. And so the heterodox folks are going out to proselytize to the orthodox folks. This is what missionary work is all about, right? So if I'm going to start being in a missionary work, I might have a case where I have lots of ties inside the group, and very little tie between the group, or I might have lots of ties, I have a lot more ties between the groups, right? So very little ties, a little more, and a lot. What does this look like, right? So this is the case where there's very little ties between the orthodox and the heterodox. And this is the case where there's lots of ties between the orthodox and the heterodox. Let this go through. So this is light mixing, right? You get, of course, radically different opinions. For what it's worth, this is what you are probably going to see when you think about adolescents and adults, right? So we have pretty little mixing between adolescents and adults, and so they go off and create their own world. At least this is Coleman's model for what happens between adolescents and adults, is that to the extent that we throw them in a high school, ignore them, and sort of let them sort of go about their own business, and we have no connectivity. On the other hand, if you mix with them a little more, right, it comes closer, mix with them a lot, you can pretty much take care of them, right? So the peer influence solution to adolescent culture being sort of antagonistic is to just swamp them with love, right? Just love them, love them, love them, right? If each of us, we outnumber them, right? So if each of us were to spend a little bit of time with an adolescent, completely swamp them, if the model is right, right? The nice thing about this model is that you can really think about these things working in different ways. And so I might, for example, have different, I can take this very general basic model and generalize it in different ways. So instead of having a fixed parameter across the entire population where we all have the same kind of interpersonal influence, I can make this a vector, right? So now it's the case that I'm more susceptible to interpersonal influence than somebody else is, right? And there could be things that predict that. It might be that I'm stupid and gullible. It might be that I'm, old and stubborn. There's lots of ways that can affect this interpersonal influence vector, and so that we can imagine setting it. One way might be that I have an organizational requirement to believe what I believe, right? So I'm a party leader. My job is to say that whatever the Tories say is what is right. And so I am not going to change my opinion no matter what the hell you tell me, right? That's my job as a spokesperson for the organization. And so long as I'm tied to the others in my organization, right, I can shape the entire belief space, right? So because you have some people out here who will not change their opinion by virtue of their position in the organization, right, everyone else, who are reasonable, right, will be spread out around them. And so you can imagine how different, the holdings of different positions in this space can constrain the overall distribution of beliefs in the population. And this is what advertisers are paid to do, right? So if you're a political opponent or doing something, my job, right, as a political consultant is to say that, my guy is right, your guy's a fool, and I'm going to hold that come hell or high water, right? Or if you go to a management talk and you hear the economists sort of say, like, this is my opinion, I don't care what the evidence is, you're wrong, your omitted variable has destroyed everything, right? So this is sort of the way we work in academic departments. So there's lots of ways you can extend this model, and I think that it's fun to think about this, particularly if you're interested in trying to explain a particular kind of problem. So it's been really interesting the last few years to see new people develop new versions of this model to explain political polarization. Right? So are there features of the way I weight W, say if you're a member of my group versus not, that can, instead of being a consensus model, it might be that I have a negative reaction to what a Republican says versus a Democrat says, right? So if cross-group beliefs might push me apart whereas within groups beliefs might pull us together. So you can imagine specifying W in a way that does it. And this is what's nice about this model, is that it's incredibly general. Now, estimating that model in real data is kind of a pain in the ass, but thinking about it theoretically is a nice way to help us come up with some rigor in the way in which we specify these features. One of the nice ones, Noah Friedkin had a nice paper that came out just about a year and a half ago, where you imagine that there's interconnected beliefs by logical consistency, right? So if you assume that people have to have, if I believe that bears talk to donkeys, then I also believe that donkeys are grumpy, and I believe that bears like honey, right? And so I might have a schema about the ways in which these different kinds of organizations are related, and that schema puts constraints on how a change in one belief implies a change in another belief. And so you can align the W matrix and now a matrix of Ys, a matrix of beliefs that have connections between them. So instead of having a vector of beliefs, I now have a matrix of beliefs, and that matrix of beliefs have a set of logical constraints on how they can change, and then a feedback process on the interpersonal influence effect. So it's a really general model, and it's really limited only by your creativity into how you think about the social process works. And this is where a lot of the work that was talked about a couple days ago, where you're doing some mixed methods or qualitative work, if you hear from your participants how they're changing their mind or what they're believing, you can build it into a model like this and generalize it. So it's a really nice way to work with that. Now, the hard part about the model is if you want to estimate it, right, we need to find some way to actually put this model into a statistical framework. And from that statistical framework, try to get good estimates of the pieces that come out of this. The nice thing, again, that this is, as it's specified anyway, if you're willing to believe the equilibrium assumption, this is just a network autocorrelation model, and so you can work with that. This value, this WY, once you multiply it out, this is a square vector, this is n by n, this is n by 1, right? So you end up with an n by 1 vector, which is just your, it ends up being just like literally just a variable, right? So this is a regression equation. This thing, this WY, in the even model, right, if I'm just evenly weighting all my ties, is just the average of my friends. So the simplest, non-stupid, perfectly reasonable, logically consistent model is it says that my beliefs are some function of the average of my friends' beliefs. Right? So we can run that model pretty straightforward. If you've got a data set, you can what proportion of my friends smoke, then that should predict my own smoking. Right? Now it might be then that I want to change that to say that instead of, and then W becomes a weight vector on my friend's behavior. So it might be reciprocity or behavior or what have you, but again, it just fits right into a regression context. There's the obvious problem, of course, is that by definition, these cases are not independent, and so this is the network autocorrelation feature. And in general, if the only effect on Y was through the transformation of W, right? If this were it, then these errors would still be conditionally independent, and this model would be fine. Most of the time, because of data error or whatever in the world is going on in the world, or the fact that the world is much more complex than the data we actually collected, if you have an interpersonal influence, you probably also have some error that you haven't accounted for over here, right? And so there's some structural conditions that lead to error across this network. So this straightforward estimation of this as specified, you can often get lots of the autocorrelation in here. There's often second order autocorrelation that you want to take care of in one way or another. You can deal with this non-parametrically. This is exactly what the QAP model is designed to do. So the QAP model is a network autocorrelation model where instead of letting us estimate this parametrically and violate all the assumptions that are built into the parametric model, we just use the non-parametric QAP to assess significance, and then you go home. A lot of people don't like that. They still want to have a slightly more variance in order to do some of the variance decomposition things. They want to have something a little more some blended on parametric or not parametric. The direct way to estimate this model is called the linear network autocorrelation model. My favorite model is the QAD model, which is the quick and dirty. That is, just ignore it and go home. And Patrick Dorian says it works, and so I just cite Patrick and call it a day. And you can't actually do that. Reviewers won't put up with it. The honest truth is that for most of the time, if you do these models in any mod or maximum likelihood framework, you're going to be fine. Again, it's just whether or not we specify them well. One thing to keep in mind that any difference, if you want to think about what this kind of a space looks like, we're used to thinking about it as a predicting Y. you can also simultaneously predict the difference between two people given that they're tied. So I really like these dyadic models, where I say what's the probability of you and I being different, so what's our distance on some different variable as a function of being connected. Right? And that's a really nice way of doing something because it allows me to have a different effect on you depending on some other features. So I can add not just that we're friends, but that we're colleagues and so forth, and the interaction between those. There's lots of ways you can specify that model at the dyadic level that takes as primary the relationship, and that relationship can have some specific features that guide our similarity. The disadvantage, right, is that now you now, of course, have a really, you've gone from having one kind of autocorrelation to also now having a nested effect, so that the dyads are nested inside individuals, and if it's a symmetric belief model, it's now cross-nested, because my dyad is both yours and mine, so it's kind of a pain in the ass. But again, the QAP model solves some of this, and that's and that works fairly well. I want to talk now about why this model goes wrong, and what people dislike about these models. But before I get there, I want to see if there's any questions about the model per se or about the general theory that we're playing with. All right. So, please go ahead. This is actually one of the beauties of this model, right? Because remember what this is. This model, at the end of the day, this is an egocentric model, right? So if I believe that equilibrium has come in my setting, I might sample from that equilibrium, but the underlying social process, the real network that you've sampled your ego network from, is still a big W. You just don't happen to observe it all. But at the end of the day, because we're willing to make the equilibrium assumption, it still ends up being an ego network calculation of my behavior against my friends. So what's really nice about this model is you can estimate it with ego network data so long as you're willing to make the equilibrium assumption. And unless you have dynamic data, you have to make the equilibrium assumption, right? So most of the time, you can estimate this part of the model, right? If you really just care about the interpersonal influence effect, you can assume that there's a connected social process going on out in the world without having sampled that entire process and still get a valid estimate of it. And that's really a nice feature. And in fact, one of the nice things about it is if your ego networks are a small sample of a much larger set, you probably don't have as much autocorrelation between the cases as you do otherwise. Right? Again, as with Bria's point the other day, I'm a fan of ego network models for lots of these kinds of reasons. They do solve some of these kinds of problems. So as a vehicle for explaining what can go wrong with these models and how we might think about them, I present to you Exhibit A, which is the spread of obesity over a large network over 32 years. This is the Friends Make You Fat paper that just generated a firestorm of criticism, right? And so the basic idea of this paper was that obesity is contagious, right? And the thinking that obesity is contagious was like, what? That's not true. Right? Obesity is behavior. It's because people are doing things. Or obesity is genetic. It can't possibly be contagious. And I think they picked this language deliberately to be a little bit provocative. But if you think about obesity as a two-step process that has to do with some kind of a behavior that then leads to a biometric outcome, then saying that behavior is a function of one's fears is not nearly as controversial. But the way they ended up doing this, right, is they ended up identifying a latent network, or sort of a network they didn't think was going to be a network, in the Framingham Heart Study data. And what these data were, right, these were things that were people filled out about their relationships with others as part of the data collection process. So like, if we can't find you in 6 months and we want to interview you, who should we find, right? Which is like, so all of this stuff that you do in a longitudinal survey to make sure you can retain your sample usually involves collecting network data. And Christakis and Fowler recognized this, and then went back and had 32 years worth of data on these people to look at their network. And because it's this nice, small, closed community, the network ends up being highly connected. And so what the point that drove the paper was this dynamics that in the 70s, you had a bunch of young, fit folks, and so the size of the circle is proportional to their BMI, and they're green if they're under the obesity cutoff, and they're yellow if they're above. And then over time, what happens is, like the rest of us, we stop exercising and so forth, and you end up with a lot more large yellow orbs than small green orbs 32 years later, right? This is why I only eat half the lunch anymore. This paper just killed me. I couldn't do anything about it. And what they noticed, of course, in this paper is that there's a nice strong correlation between your BMI and your peer's BMI as you go for your direct peers, 2 steps away, 3 steps away. And so the claim they made in this paper was that within 3 steps of separation, there's an association, and they sort of hinted at a causal association between your behavior and your peers' behavior. And every economist in the country just went nuts. It's like, no, that can't possibly be true. And the way they did, it's important, I think, to think for a minute about, and so the critique of this is that what we see here is an association. There's an association between my outcome and your outcome, and we happen to be connected. And the critique is, well, you don't know what's driving that association, right? Am I forcing food down your throat? Am I saying, no, don't go for a run, let's go get a beer, right? Or is it the case that we both happen to live right next to the best mac and cheese joint in town, and as a function of both being neighbors and close to the best mac and cheese joint in town, we gained a lot of weight and didn't go running, right? And so what you would like to be able to do is account for this. And the models they estimated were of the following sort. And they had 2 different versions of it, and we can talk about them both. But the main one that they modeled was this edgewise regression, which is the notion that you have ego's current weight is a function of alter's current weight plus alter's previous weight plus ego's previous weight plus a bunch of controls they had in the model. What this looks like from a sort of a regression scatter plot kind of idea is that at time 1 I have ego, and ego can only have 1 weight, and alters can have a variance in weight. At time 2, at time 3, notice that we're all getting heavier from time 1 to time 3, right? And so we can imagine then effectively fitting a line to this cloud of points. And there are some statistical issues with this. It's not clear you always want to do that, and particularly because it might be that there's some individual level effects that are different from the overall cloud of points effects. So you might decide to do a random effects model, right, which is in fact what they did, right? And so then you end up saying that the effect of alter on ego is nested within ego, and for some people it's very positive, and for other people there's no association at all. Right? This is not an unreasonable model in itself. The problem with the model, right, is that we don't know how good this set of controls are. And in fact, because these are found data, the set of controls are probably pretty crappy. You do the best you can in these kind of big studies, but you're kind of out of luck. Now, they did a different version of this model, which is they took a difference, so ego's previous minus ego, so this is a difference in difference model, ego's previous minus ego's current. The beauty of the difference in difference models is that any fixed effects in the controls, like any things like my genetics that shouldn't have changed over time, we can control out. Didn't deal with the critiques much. I'm not going to go through all of these in excruciating detail because I think lunch is here, and I'm starting to get a little bit boring, I'm sure. But in the slides, I go through some really detailed critiques of the Christakis-Fowler model, because there was about 3 years worth of exchanges on this. And there's a link to a set of papers where Christakis and Fowler go through and catalog all these critiques and give sort of a point rejection of them. Sometimes, you know, these are people staking out opinions, so you can decide whether you believe them or not. But it's a very nice sort of case study in what the critiques are and what the potential solutions to those critiques are. The main critique, one of my favorite versions of this is folks are saying that these models are heavily confounded by essentially setting effects and by these selection effects. And so what you could do as an antidote to the Christakis and Fowler model is estimate the exact same type of model where the dependent variable couldn't possibly be contagious, right? And so in this case, what they use is the friend-skinned problem. So is my acne a function of your acne? Or whether or not it was my headaches, or my headaches a function of your headaches. Now, of course, if you talk to Fowler when he's had a beer or two, he'll tell you about all the ways in which your acne is a function of our joint behavior, right? And how if you've ever met my sister, you'll know why I have a headache, right? So it's not clear that these things are always as strong. And what Fletcher and Cole find is that you can get a significant association even when these things shouldn't be a plausible reason. Now, the critique of this, of course, is these are really, really simple models. Like they have almost no controls on them, and the significance levels are 0.1 or higher, so they're not really a strong effect. And if you do any kind of reasonable sensitivity analysis, these effects go away. The other critique they made is that there's a lot of critique on both the directional differences argument and the three-step differences. And this is because of some overlapping confidence intervals. And in this case, I think that probably the critics of Lyon, in particular critics of Fowler, are right, and that they would make claims about this thing being significantly different from 0, this thing not being significantly different from 0, and then saying these two things are significantly different from each other. And you just can't do that. That's just a basic statistical issue. That's just uncertainty that we have in the world around us. And I think that they probably did make a mistake in sort of doubling down on some of those kinds of claims. They had insufficient control for homophily, for example. I think that the critiques are probably right there. The directionality cannot distinguish the source of the association. The critique here was that in response to some of the critiques, Christakis and Fowler re-estimated their models and showed that essentially the effect that if I named you as an alter, it was more effective than if we just flipped those around. So if I said Craig was my friend, then Craig's behavior affected me. But if I didn't say, if Craig said I was his friend and I didn't reciprocate, then it turns out that Craig's behavior wouldn't affect me, right? And so Christakis and Fowler took this as a social recognition argument, and Lyons argues that you'd expect to find the same logic from a simple foci feature. I actually think that's incorrect, because directionality implies, a foci generator would imply symmetric effects across the features, whereas in fact what you're seeing are asymmetric effects across the feature. There is a random permutation test cannot establish a three-degree rule. And the reason here is that the critique is, though, these are incomplete found data, and you think it's a three-step tie, but in fact, you just didn't collect a bunch of the stuff with a one-step tie. It's true. There's lots of things we don't have, but unconvincing, right? So there's a reason that I named one person as opposed to another, and it's probably has to do with this, with the importance of the tie, and the importance of the tie then probably drives the reality of the association. So in this case, I think that if you go down that route, the Lyons critique on this one, what you're saying is that you can't infer a peer effect unless you have perfect peer data, and we're never going to have perfect peer data, and so at that point we should pack it up and go home. Similarly, the models are statistically inconsistent, if not coherent. This is when it's really fun to read this exchange, right? Because these are people that are just pissed at each other and have dug in on a point of view. So if you want to get that kind of nice sort of intellectual history sort of each of it. And at this point, he's saying that there are features of this model that make the effects statistically unidentifiable. It's just not, I think in this case, he's just actually incorrect. I don't believe this is actually true. And it's also way down in the reads. And so essentially it's a way of separating out the model. And if you separate out the model in a way that they didn't actually estimate, you couldn't get the answer that they did estimate. And so that just seems probably not true. What was fun about this exchange is that it went off on the SOCNet list as well. And so people were exchanging these papers and weighing in on it. It was a big debate in the field. And Tom Schneider's at one point came to the conclusion that I think is probably right, which is that the logical consequence of this exchange is that we are stuck with imperfect models. Lyons argues as though only perfect models are acceptable, and while applauding such lofty ideals, I still believe that we should accept imperfection in life as in science. Right? Progress is made by discussion and improvement of imperfections, not by their eradication. Right? The idea is we got to do something. And if the idea is that we can't do anything until we can do the exact perfect thing, we're never going to get anywhere. And so over the last 20 years, since this has gone on, right, there's been a huge amount of literature, and we're going to talk about more of it in the experiment section and so forth. But the idea is that it turns out we can do some things. Now, the other critique that comes out of this work is this paper by Shalizi and Thomas, which says that peer influence effects are generally confounded. And that is that if I think about my effect as a function of the people I'm connected to, that if there's ever any way that these folks are connected above, right, that we can get this backwards effect by virtue of the fact that we share a feature as opposed to the fact that we haven't investigated, as opposed to the fact that we're actually connected to each other. And that this is and if you think about what this model actually means, what it's saying is that if you have an omitted variable, your model's wrong, which is true. It's always true. And it's a case that they're making is that this is a general confounding of any kind of peer effect that is driven by a selection effect. The counter argument that people haven't made much of course, is that if it's true for a peer effect, it's true for the non-peer effects as well, right? So if you want to tell me that my peer effects model is confounded because I've missed the non-peer effects that might select me into being peers with each other, then your model without network effects is generally confounded because you've also omitted the peer effect, which you're not saying isn't true, you're just saying is incomplete. So this is a model that's as good for the goose as it is for the gander, and again, it gets us down to the spot that we can't do anything if we don't do something. So I think that's there. So what do you do to correct this problem? We're going to have a discussion about experimental models, which is probably the gold standard for correcting it, though those have some of their own issues. The strongest possible correction and most observational data is to use these things called fixed effects or other kinds of instrumental variable models, where you have some ability to try to disentangle the pure selection effect on unobserved variables. The other way to do it is to model both simultaneously the selection effect and the influence effect. These are called stochastic actor-oriented models. Tom Schneider has developed most of these, and there we are. Dave is going to tell us about those on Friday. The other way to do this, I think, is to think a little bit about sensitivity analysis. There we are. I'm getting ahead of myself. I really like sensitivity analysis models as ways of dealing with this, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is identify whether or not the causal effect of a peer association that we've observed could have been accounted for by something else that we didn't account for, either by reflection or endogeneity or what have you. And the nice thing about sensitivity analyses is that we can ask ourselves, well, if I have an effect that I've observed, in this case this is a Siena model, can I ask whether or not that model, that effect could be due to something else? Tyler Vanderweel has a really nice paper on sensitivity effects, sensitivity models for peer effects, in which he finds the Christakis and Fowler papers are largely consistent. My favorite current model for doing sensitivity analysis is from Ken Frank's tool called Confounded. And what's beautiful about this tool is that he's provided it now in any which way from Sunday. If you just want to do an Excel sheet, you can do that. Or you can go to the web page and use the calculator. And it's a really nice effect. What you do is you say, you can literally take a paper, you can put it on your phone if you want. You can say, what's the effect size? What's the standard error reported? How many cases are there? How big's the model? Push run, and you discover that in this case, the percent necessary to invalidate inference, I can't read it on the screen, is you'd have to have that 82% of the cases would have to be 0 for this effect to go away. And so it's a very nice feature to say, all right, you're right? None of these models are perfect, but we're not ignorant about what the imperfection would have to look like to invalidate the results. And so what we can say is, yep, I might have an emitted variable, but that emitted variable would have to be correlated at point whatever with my observed variable to invalidate this case. Or to flip it around, if you think about this in a treatment and control effect, I'd have to move 80% of my cases from the treatment effect to the control effect to invalidate the results. Now, if it's 80%, you go, you know what? I know this setting pretty well. There's probably nothing out there that's 80% and it's good. If it's 12%, maybe I should be worried. But what's nice is what you're doing now is not saying the model can't be estimated, it's wrong. The model is perfect, it's great. You're saying there's some level of unknowability for this, and we're just honest about it. We're saying I'm really certain about this effect. I'm not so certain about the other. It needs more research. And I think that's the pragmatic solution for going forward with this work. All right. And we're not going to go over experiments until later. Question, that's a lot of material, even by the confines of this workshop. Questions, comments, or thoughts? Again, tomorrow we're going to go over experiments, sort of experimental ideas this afternoon. We're going to go over stochastic actor-oriented models, the simultaneous modeling tomorrow morning. And I just wanted to let you know there are lots of ways you can do this, but the key is I'm going to try to do something worthwhile. Other questions? People are quiet before lunch. Go ahead. How do I think about using ergom for this? Yeah, so you can't use ergom for peer influence models. You can ask whether or not a behavior predicts a tie in an ergom, right? If you want to use the ergom kind of framework, that's what the stochastic actor-oriented models are. So the R-Siena models are ergom-like in the sense that you're simultaneously modeling the network, but then you're saying that there's this trade-off. There's this, there's this objective function that I have that as a person, I can either be your friend or I can smoke, but I got to balance the two. And so what the ergom does is it says, well, let's let those models happen simultaneously and see which kind of a process is most consistent with the data. Now, as Tom, because he's a very careful person, points out, our Siena models are still models based on observed variables, right? And so you're always at risk to unobserved heterogeneity in the world that you haven't corrected for. The solution for that is to put some friggin' variables in your model, right? We're not as stupid as a lot of these models assume we are. And we often have a lot more data than we think we do. And so I think there's a lot we can do to actually control for things objectively, but also there are other kinds of things we can do like fixed effects and so forth that allow us to look for unobserved variables. My concern, quite frankly, to put it on the table, I'll be completely honest with you, I'm so bored with the selection or influence debate. It's no different than the nature or nurture debate. The answer is yes, right? There is both selection and influence. And at this point, we've now have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of studies that are really strong instrumental variable controls or Siena models or what have you, showing that we can, in fact, find peer influence, that the reality of peer influence shouldn't be up for debate. The question should be, we might have overestimated it 20 years ago, and now we're not overestimating it, but with any luck, but my sense is we're probably underestimating at this point, given the huge number of controls we're putting on things. And what we're doing instead is sort of fighting the fight, is there any peer influence, as opposed to how can we leverage peer influence to make the world a better place, which I think is probably a more reasonable thing to do. But that's outside of my instruction hat and with my political hat, so we'll do some of that later. Get me talking with the beer at the baseball game, and I'll really get you going on it. Other questions? Awesome. Lunch is here. Let's have some lunch, take a break, stretch, and come back, and we'll talk about electronic medical records.